Hello everyone, I'm Adisha Goswami. Today I'll be presenting on a kind of summarization of the article which is titled as The State and Globalization, written by Kevin Blore, and it was published in 2022 on May 16. At the initial part, the author has bifurcated the idea between nation state and national sovereignty. So, as we try to look into the idea of nation state, it can be called as a legal as and a theoretical concept. The idea nation is a constructed entity and an intangible entity based upon collective identity, whereas nation state is a territorial construct, and most importantly, it is a legal concept based upon the idea of sovereignty, territoriality, etc. Coming to national sovereignty, so it refers to the ability of a state to impose a system of government upon its citizens, and it can be of external sovereignty as well as internal sovereignty. Then the author also talks about de facto sovereignty, which means that the ability to act in certain manner as the ultimate decision making power over a defined territory, and also sovereignty as de jure sovereignty, which merely refers to the technical and the legal ultimate decisions making power of an active or an agent, and that's the state. De facto or the political sovereignty is greater in terms of its importance than the de jure or the legal sovereignty. Then the author has defined what is globalization. So globalization can be defined as a complex web of mutual interdependence or dependence within a multitude of areas, and the areas can be of economic, social, political, cultural, etc. Marshall McLuhan, he believes that we inhabited a global village in which the world is getting smaller. The author has made the point that globalization can be seen in three areas: economic, political, and cultural. So, political globalization can be called as the intensification and expansion of political interrelations across the globe. Economic globalization can be called as increasing integration of national economies into a single global market. And the cultural globalization, it can be called as a rapid worldwide exchange of ideas, values, traditions, etc. Considering the impact of globalization on state systems, David Held argues that globalization consists of widening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of contemporary life. So, mutual interdependence is perhaps the most overtly expressed within the realm of economic globalization. Interconnectedness has become another aspect of humanitarian intervention. So therefore, Professor Anthony McGrew, he points out that the sovereign power and authority of national government is being transformed, not necessarily eroded. And Robert Cohen, he particularly talks about the idea of interconnectedness and mutual interdependence, and which will contribute towards the establishment of a more peaceful world order. So, in the regard of impact of globalization on state system, we can have positive as well as negative views. Then, if we try to look into the challenge of globalization to state control over the citizens, then it can be said that the process of globalization, it make it more difficult for the state to perform the fundamental function of maintaining social order within its border. The 21st century politics is increasingly conducted on a cross-border level. Our national policies are being highly influenced by the international mandates, international rules and regulations. The agents of the state remain most important elements in terms of maintaining laws and order, but we cannot say that our state is the sole agent for everything. Coming to the next part, on the development of international law alongside globalization. The author, uh, the author provides two views. One is for of the liberals and one is of the realist view. Liberals believe that the creation of a more just system of international relations require international law, whereas realists believe that the globalization has done little to alter the fundamental basis of international law. Then he introduced two ideas. That is, one is the just ad bellum, which particularly talks about the condition on which a war may be considered as just. And for example, we can have the example of Event Charter Article 7 and Chapter 24, where evanescence can authorize military actions. And then in the next concept, just in bello, it's a sort of action which is just during a warfare. For instance, the use of chemical weapons is prohibited under the international law, and the treatment of captured military personnel or medical staff and non-military civilians is covered under the four separate Geneva Conventions. In the next section, the author talks about the humanitarian and possible intervention in a globalized world, where he particularly talks about the intervention made by the international agencies in the name of humanitarian intervention, and he also mentioned about the uh, sovereignty, how the sovereignty has shifted from a right to a responsibility, and the emergence of the concept of R2P. And he has given the example of humanitarian intervention in Kosovo, where we all know that the aftermath of the Bosnian War, the Yugoslav uh, forces sought to eradicate the Albanian population in Kosovo, and then the Kosovo Liberation Army was formed as a reaction to the human rights abuses by the Serbian forces in Kosovo. Then NATO sought to intervene on the behalf of the Kosovan Albanians. Although the Security Council failed to authorize the intervention, the NATO engaged a campaign of airstrikes in an attempt to defeat the Serbian force. So it can be said that the humanitarian intervention is a kind of a threat to the national sovereignty of the nation, as well as it is also a kind of responsibility of the international system, or the in order to protection for the protection of the human rights of that affected areas. Then we can see hyperglobalists, skeptics, and transformationalists, three three groups of scholars, or three groups which define globalization or view globalization from three perspectives. For the hyperglobalizers, the globalization represents the gradual demise of the sovereign state. The skeptics believe that there are many waves of globalization in the present wave face some challenges from several opponents, and the transformationist it's a kind of a balanced approach. David Held and Anthony McGrew, they are particularly belonging from this strand. So they believe that both hyper-globalists as well as the skeptic exaggerate their arguments, and therefore it is important to have a balanced position in terms of considering the negative as well as the positive aspect of globalization. Then coming to the debates concerning the impact of globalization, so we can see that globalization has pros as well as cons. In terms of interdependence, mutual dependence, interconnectedness, globalization has played a very important role. But in terms of losing their own identity, in terms of intervention by the in the national affairs by the international actors, influence of the international actors over the national politics, you can see a kind of decreased role of the state. So it's very difficult to have a very clear perspective about the impact of globalization, as we can see a twin impact of globalization, pros and cons. As I have already mentioned in the slide, so we can see that how the globalization has impacted upon different really political, economic, and cultural aspects, and as well as how different thinkers or different scholars saw this entire debate. Coming to the next part, which is the last part. So the author has examine the extent to which the globalization addresses the contemporary issues, and under that he particularly talks about poverty, conflict, and human rights. Under poverty, he believes that there are attempts to address the problem of poverty. Uh, for example, Millennial Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals talk about that. The tendency of giving foreign aid by the wealthy nation state it was criticized by the anti-globalists. Com- in terms of conflict, we can see a spread of democratic norms underpinned by the economic interdependence, and it reduces the number of conflict between the states. It also, we can see a kind of global pattern of the conflict. For example, global terrorism or the spread of information has made the entire discourse a global discourse. Also, new discourses come regarding the collective effort in order to combat such difficulties. For example, we need international cooperation or global cooperation in terms of combating global issues such as environmental threats or for say global terrorism, etc. The last aspect is the human rights. So we can see that in UDHR demonstrates that the sovereign states are both willing and able to specify fundamental human rights. And the effectiveness of human rights within the contemporary era is a subject to debate. And human rights is also being criticized for its Eurocentric nature. So, as conclusion, the author has provided that this chapter sought to provide an overview of the role and the significance of the state and globalization. It provided an outline of the concepts such as nation state, national sovereignty, mutual interdependence, and the impact of globalization. And it must, however, be acknowledged that globalization provides the means by which the transactional issues can be addressed. Thank you.